The lattice burned black before the judges ever saw it. Smoke curled from the kitchen window of a farm 3 years married, and a young bride stood weeping over a pan she could not save. Now she carried a pie across the fairgrounds, steady-handed, while the whole of Harlan County turned to watch and remembered exactly how badly she had once failed. 3 years earlier, Grace Bowen had set her first wedding supper before her husband and watched him chew bravely through scorched biscuits. Her mother-in-law, visiting from Ohio, had patted her wrist and said the thing Grace would carry like a stone in her apron for years. A burned crust only means you weren't paying attention yet. Pay attention long enough, and the oven becomes your friend. Grace had not understood it then. She understood it now, walking toward the judging table, finally awake. The Bowen farm sat 8 miles west of Cottonwood Falls, Kansas, where the tall grass ran in waves to a horizon unbroken by anything but their crooked windmill. Daniel Bowen had farmed it since his father passed, and he farmed it the way his father had, stubbornly, hopefully, and a little behind. He was a broad, quiet man with sunburned forearms and a habit of whistling when worried, which meant Grace had heard a great deal of whistling lately. Grace had come from Topeka, a schoolteacher's daughter who could conjugate Latin verbs, but had never once been taught to bake. Their wedding had been small. Their first year had been lean. Her cooking had been, by every honest account, a catastrophe. The biscuits came out like creek stones. The first pie she attempted produced a kitchen full of smoke and a crust the neighbors still mentioned at church socials, kindly, the way people mention a flood the town remembered. Cottonwood Falls was small enough that a single ruined pie could follow a woman for years. At the Mercantile, Mr. Aldous Pruitt, who owned half the storefronts on Main and held the paper on a quarter of the county's farms, had a way of smiling at Grace that made her feel measured. He had bought up debt all spring, patient as a spider, and folks who fell behind found themselves with new terms and a shorter rope. The Bowens had fallen behind. A hailstorm in May had flattened the wheat. Daniel had borrowed against the next harvest to replant, and the replanting had come up thin in a dry June. By July, the note Pruitt had quietly purchased from the bank was due in 3 weeks, and they were short by $90 they did not have and could not find. Daniel spoke of selling the team, the wagon, his father's tools. He spoke of hiring out to the railroad and leaving Grace to mind the place alone. He whistled in the barn until midnight. What Grace did not tell him, what she had not told anyone, was that for the better part of a year she had been rising before the sun. While Daniel slept, she had been baking, quietly, methodically, burning crust after crust in the gray dawn light and burying the evidence in the hog trough before he woke. She had been paying attention. She had been waiting for a reason worth the risk of being laughed at again. The county fair gave her one. The handbill was nailed to the post outside the Mercantile, fluttering in the hot wind. Grace read it twice, to be sure. Harlan County Fair, August. Among the listed contests, livestock and quilts and preserves, one line stopped her cold. Grand Pie Competition. First prize, $100, donated by the Cottonwood Falls Merchants Association. $100. $10 more than they owed. Grace stood very still while a cart rattled past behind her. $100 was a sum men worked a season for. It was the farm. It was the difference between staying and scattering. She became aware of Mr. Pruitt watching her from the doorway of his store, a toothpick turning slowly at the corner of his mouth. "Thinking of entering, Mrs. Bowen," he said, pleasant as poison. "I do recall your last attempt at a pie. Whole town recalls it." Grace folded the handbill and put it in her pocket. She did not tell Daniel that night. She lay awake instead, listening to him breathe, turning the arithmetic over and over. $100. The note was 90. There would even be a little left for seed. But the contest cost $2 to enter, and $2 was not a thing they could waste on her pride. And there was the other matter, the larger one, the one that sat on her chest like the cat that liked to sleep there. She might lose. Worse than lose, she might fail in front of everyone. the way she had failed before, and give the whole county a fresh story to tell for another 3 years. Daniel had defended her cooking to every man who teased him. If she stood up at that fair and produced another ruin, she would shame them both. In the morning, she watched Daniel at the table, eating the bread she'd baked. Good bread now, though he never seemed to notice it had ever been otherwise. And she nearly told him. The words came up to her teeth. Then he said, not looking at her, Pruitt offered to buy the South 40 outright, said he'd be doing us a kindness. His jaw worked. I told him no. Maybe I shouldn't have. Kindness. The word curdled. Grace went out to the garden and knelt in the bean rows and thought. She thought about her mother-in-law's hands guiding hers over a bowl. That single visit, the only real instruction she'd ever had. Pay attention long enough, and the oven becomes your friend. She thought about the 100 crusts she'd burned and buried. She thought about the last dozen, which had come out golden and even, which had cooled on the windowsill behind the chicken coop, where no one could see, smelling like something she had finally earned. She had been afraid for a year to find out whether she was good or only less terrible. The fair would tell her. The fair would tell everyone. If she entered and lost, the humiliation would be public and complete. If she did not enter, she would never know, and they would lose the farm anyway, quietly, the respectable way, and she would spend her life wondering. She thought, there is no safe road here. There is only the road where I try and the road where I don't. That evening, after Daniel had gone to the barn to whistle at the dark, Grace took $2 from the coffee tin where she'd been seen saving egg money, pressed them flat, and set them by the door beside her good bonnet. She walked the 8 miles to Cottonwood Falls the next morning before the heat came up, her $2 knotted in a handkerchief. The fair committee kept its register in the back of the Grange Hall, a ledger overseen by Mrs. Hetty Vance, a widow with sharp eyes and a softer heart than her face advertised. Pie competition, Grace said, and laid her coins on the table. Mrs. Vance's pen paused. She looked at Grace a long moment. Everyone in this county knew everyone, and everyone knew the smoke. Then she dipped the pen and wrote Mrs. Grace Bowen in a firm, fair hand. 3 weeks, Tuesday, Mrs. Vance said. Bring it whole, we judge at noon. Grace walked home lighter and more frightened than she had ever been. It was Mrs. Vance who became, without quite meaning to, Grace's confidant. Grace took to stopping at the Grange on her egg-selling days, and the widow, who had baked for 40 years and buried a husband who'd loved her, dried apple pie above all earthly things, began in sidelong fashion to talk shop. Cold hands, Mrs. Vance said once, weighing eggs. Whatever else you do, child, cold hands and cold butter. Warm hands make tough crust, and a tough crust is a confession. She never once asked how Grace's practicing went, but she left a tin of good lard on the counter one day and said only, "Mismarked, take it." Now the secret baking had a purpose, and purpose changed everything. Before, Grace had practiced in a fog of private shame, baking to prove something only to herself. Now she baked the way a soldier drills. She rose at 4, while the east was still the color of a bruise healing, and she worked until she heard Daniel stir. And then she hid it all and made breakfast as though her hands smelled of nothing but coffee. The apples were the problem, and the apples were the answer. The Bowen orchard was old, planted by Daniel's grandfather, a dozen gnarled trees that produced a hard, tart, unfashionable apple nobody in town thought much of. The fashionable pie at the fair, everyone knew, was made with sweet-eating apples, the kind Pruett's mercantile sold at a markup. But the Bowens had no money for Pruett's apples, and so Grace was left with her own crooked harvest, green and sharp enough to make a person wince. She wept over the first batch, not from feeling but from frustration, the filling gone to gray mush, weeping juice through the bottom crust until the whole thing slumped like a collapsed barn. She buried it in the hog trough. The hogs, at least, had grown to love her cooking. But she was paying attention now. She noticed that the tart apples held their shape where the sweet ones would have surrendered. She noticed that they wanted less time and more sugar, but not so much sugar that they turned to syrup. She noticed that a spoonful of the sorghum Daniel kept in the cellar deepened the flavor into something that tasted like autumn itself. She kept a slate by the stove and wrote everything down in her schoolteacher's daughter hand. Oven hot or slow, butter cold or soft, how long, how much, what happened. She learned that the smoke from her famous disaster had come from juice boiling over onto the oven floor, and that a rim of crust crimped high and a slit cut clean in the top would let the steam escape without the flood. Such a small thing. 3 years of mockery, and the cure was a knife and 2 minutes of attention. She learned the crust by ruining 40 of them. Too much water made it leathery. Too little made it crack and crumble like dry creek mud. She learned to add the ice water a spoonful at a time, to stop the moment the dough held together and not a heartbeat after. To handle it the way you'd handle a baby bird. Quickly, gently, and then set it down. Cold hands, Mrs. Vance had said. Grace held her hands in the spring water until they ached before she touched the butter. By the second week, she had a pie she was not ashamed of. By the middle of the third, she had a pie that stopped her in the kitchen, a slice of it on a chipped plate at 5 in the morning. The tart apple and the sorghum and the flaked, shattering crust, and she sat down at the table and ate it slowly in the dark and felt, for the first time since her wedding, fully competent at something with her own hands. The trouble was the hiding. Daniel nearly caught her twice. Once he came in early from the barn with a lame horse, and she had to slide a hot pie into the cold ash bin and sit on the stool in front of it, talking too brightly about nothing, while the smell of cinnamon filled the room, and he sniffed and said, "You been baking?" And she said, "Just bread." And he believed her because he had no reason not to. The second time was worse. He found a smear of filling on the slate where she'd written her notes, and he picked the slate up and frowned at the columns of figures. Oven, butter, time. And for a moment Grace's heart stopped, because if he read it he would know, and if he knew he would worry, and worse. He might forbid it. He might say they could not afford the apples, the lard, the wood, for all that extra fire. He might be right. "What's this?" he said. "Sums," Grace said. "I'm teaching myself to keep better accounts. So we know where we stand." It was not a lie, exactly. They did need to know where they stood. Daniel set the slate down and looked at her with such tired gratitude that she had to turn to the stove so he wouldn't see her face. "You're a good wife," he said. "Better than I've given you cause to show." She baked 4 pies that morning after he left, and 3 of them were perfect. And she stood in the doorway, watching the heat shimmer over the wheat that hadn't come, and let herself believe, just a little, that she might do this thing. The matter of money pressed harder as the fair drew near. A pie worthy of judging needed good lard, sugar enough, and most of all a steady hot fire, which meant wood, and wood meant either money or hours of Grace's own labor at the saw while Daniel was in the fields. She chose the saw. Her palms blistered, and the blisters broke and healed into calluses, and she was glad of them, because they were honest. She had no money for fine white sugar, and so she made peace with what she had. Sorghum, and the coarse brown sugar from the bottom of the barrel, and the apples that cost her nothing but the climbing. She came to suspect, baking batch after batch, that her poverty was making a better pie than any of Pruitt's expensive apples could. The sweet apple pies all tasted the same. She'd had slices at 3 church socials and could not tell one woman's from another's. Her pie tasted like no one else's because no one else was poor enough or stubborn enough to make it. She needed to know that for certain, though, and certainty meant a taster who was not a hog. So she did a dangerous thing. On a Thursday egg day, she wrapped a single slice in waxed paper and carried it to the Grange and set it on Mrs. Vance's counter without a word. The widow looked at it, looked at Grace, picked up the slice and ate it slowly, her sharp eyes going distant. She finished it. She folded the waxed paper into a neat square. And then Hetty Vance, who had not been known to weep since the funeral, pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth, and sat down hard on her stool. "Where did you learn this?" she said. It was not quite a question. "I burned 100 of them," Grace said. "My husband," Mrs. Vance said, and stopped. Started again. "My husband would have crossed the county on foot for a slice of this, the sorghum. Nobody uses the sorghum anymore. They all want it sweet and pale and forgettable." She looked up, and her face had rearranged itself into something fierce and glad. "Child, you are going to win. Do you understand me? Unless you lose your nerve, you are going to win." It should have been the happiest moment of those 3 weeks. It was nearly ruined within the hour. Grace was leaving the Grange, the praise still warm in her chest, when she came around the corner of the building and found Mr. Pruitt in conversation with one of the fair committeemen, a thin, nervous fellow named Hobbs, who owed Pruitt money the way half the county did. Grace stopped in the shade of the building, not meaning to listen, and then meaning very much to listen. "The judging's blind, I'm told," Hobbs was saying. "Numbers, not names. They don't know whose is whose. Numbers can be learned," Pruitt said. "A man on the committee would know which number sat where on the table. Hypothetically. I couldn't. You could. You will. I'm not asking you to change a result, Hobbs. I'm asking you to tell me a number, should I happen to be curious. And I'm asking you to recall that your own note comes due in September." A pause. "We understand each other." Grace's blood went cold and then hot. She pressed back against the warm boards. She understood all at once several things. She understood that Pruitt did not want her to win, that $100 in Grace Bowen's hand was $90 out of his pocket and one farm out of his web. She understood that he meant to find out which pie was hers, and she understood with a sick lurch what a man like Pruitt might do to a pie he could identify, sitting unwatched on a table, with a committeeman in his debt standing guard, a pinch of salt where the sugar should be. A thing knocked to the floor, 100 small accidents, any one of them fatal. She walked home the 8 miles and barely felt them. The pie that had been her hope was now also her vulnerability. Pruitt could not outbake her, but he did not need to. He only needed to reach her pie before the judges did. That night she sat at the table, after Daniel slept, and wrote on her slate, not sums this time, but a list. Ways the pie could be ruined. Ways it could be protected. She thought about the 8 unguarded miles between her oven and the judging table. She thought about the crowd, the committee, the long table of identical pies under their cloths. She did not yet know how she would beat him, but she knew now that beating the apples had only been the first contest. The second was a man who had spent his life making sure people like the Bowens stayed, beholden, and she would have to be cleverer than he was patient. She blew out the candle. She had 11 days. The next morning, Grace told Daniel everything. She had meant to keep it secret to the end. But Pruitt had changed the shape of the thing. This was no longer her private gamble. It was a fight for the farm, and a fight for the farm was Daniel's to share. She set a slice of the pie before him at breakfast. The real pie, not bread, not an excuse. She watched him taste it. She watched his eyebrows climb and his eyes fill and his slow mouth open and shut. "Grace," he said. "Grace, what?" "I entered the pie contest," she said. "First prize is $100. I've been practicing a year." She lifted her chin. "And Aldous Pruitt means to stop me. I need your help." Daniel believed her about the pie the moment it touched his tongue. Convincing him about Pruitt took longer, because Daniel was a fair man who found it hard to credit such patient cruelty in another. But Grace repeated the conversation she'd overheard word for word. "Your own note comes due in September." And she watched her husband's face change, from doubt to a still, banked anger she had never seen in him. "He's been buying paper all spring," Daniel said slowly. "The Olsons, the Reeds, old Whitfield. I thought he was just." He shook his head. "I thought a man could be greedy without being a wolf about it." "He's both," Grace said. They sat at the table, and they did what neither of them had done alone. They planned. It was strange and good, the two of them with their heads bent over the slate. And Grace thought that whatever else came of the contest, This had already been worth the $2. That she had a partner again at the table instead of a worried man whistling in the dark. The danger, they agreed, was the unguarded hours. A pie had to be brought whole to the Grange before noon and set on the judging table, where it sat under a cloth among the others until the judges came through. Anyone with reason to be near the table, a committeeman, say, could tamper in a moment, and the judging was blind. If Pruitt learned Grace's number, her pie was as good as poisoned with salt, so they would make sure he learned the wrong number. It was Daniel's idea, and it pleased Grace enormously, because it meant her husband had a deviousness in him she'd never had cause to admire before. They would bring two pies, one real, one decoy. The decoy would be handsome and ordinary, a sweet apple pie of the common kind, the sorts Pruitt would expect a hopeful woman to enter. They would let Pruitt's man see them fuss over the decoy, register it, set it down with care. The real pie, Grace's tart apple and sorghum masterwork, they would handle as though it were nothing, a thing brought for the bake sale table, beneath notice. But that raised the harder problem. The decoy needed a registration number, and so did the real pie, and you could only register what you brought to the table in plain sight. If Grace carried two pies to the judging, the committee would only enter one. The rules allowed a single entry per baker. It was Mrs. Vance, when Grace laid the whole tangle before her, who supplied the missing piece, and in supplying it, took her own quiet revenge on a man she had long despised. "You'll enter one pie," the widow said. "Under your name, that's the rule, and I'll keep it. But there's no rule about who carries a pie to the bake sale, nor what's in it." Her eyes glinted. "Suppose a neighbor, say, a widow woman helping with the sale, happened to set a homely-looking pie on the sale table near the judging. And suppose that homely pie were the one that mattered. And suppose the fine, handsome pie with Mrs. Bowen's number on it were the decoy all along. A man watching would guard the wrong pie, wouldn't he?" Grace stared at her. "You'd switch them, at the last moment, in front of everyone. I'd move a pie from the sale table to the entry table," Mrs. Vance said primly, "because the foolish baker set it down in the wrong place, and I am a stickler for order. Any committee member will tell you so." She permitted herself a small, dangerous smile. "Let Mr. Pruitt spend his morning watching the pretty pie. Let him hold his breath over it. And let the judges, when they come, taste yours." It was a good plan. It depended on timing and nerve, and on Pruitt's own arrogance leading him to guard the obvious thing. It could go wrong a dozen ways. But for the first time, Grace felt she was not merely defending. She was setting a trap of her own, with two willing accomplices and a year of burned crusts behind her. They had 9 days. Grace baked and Daniel sawed wood without being asked, and they practiced the handoff in the kitchen until it was smooth. Pruitt did not wait idle. A man who buys debt for a living knows how to apply pressure, and in the last week before the fair he applied it everywhere at once. First came the note, hand-delivered by Hobbs, who would not meet Grace's eye. It informed Mr. Daniel Bowen that the holder of his obligation, in light of deteriorating conditions, required payment in full on the morning of the fair, 3 days earlier than the original term. The $100, if Grace won it, would be paid out by the Merchants Association at the close of judging, near 2 o'clock. Pruitt's new deadline was noon. It was a clean, cruel stroke. Even if Grace won, the money would come too late. The farm would be forfeit by the time the ribbon was pinned. Daniel read the note twice and set it down very gently, which frightened Grace more than shouting would have. "He's thought of everything," he said. "Not everything," Grace said, though her heart was hammering. "Mrs. Vance sits on the committee, and the association keeps a cash box at the fair for the premiums, the livestock. Men get paid the same day in coin on the grounds. The $100 will be there by noon, not 2 o'clock. I've seen the box myself in the Grange office. She had a strong box the size of a bread loaf, brought out every fair for the cash premiums. If the judging finishes by noon, and if Mrs. Vance can get the premium paid out the moment they decide, that's a great many ifs. It's more ifs than Pruitt thinks we have, Grace said. The second pressure was quieter and meaner. Pruitt began in his patient way to talk. At the mercantile, on the church steps, in the hearing of anyone, he reminisced fondly and at length about the famous smoking pie of 3 years past. He wondered aloud whether a woman who'd nearly burned down her own kitchen ought to be trusted near the Grange ovens at all. He made it a joke, and the joke traveled, and by the time Grace went in to sell her eggs, she could feel it on her. The sidelong looks, the smothered smiles, the pity. It worked the way he meant it to. It got into her. The night before the fair, she stood in her kitchen over a flawless pie, the best she had ever made, and could not stop her hands from shaking. What if the year had been a delusion? What if she'd only convinced herself, and Mrs. Vance had been kind, and tomorrow she would stand before the whole county and produce another ruin? Daniel found her there. He did not tell her she was being foolish. He sat down and cut himself a slice of the practice pie and ate it and said, "I have eaten everything you've cooked for 3 years, the bad and the good. I know the difference better than any judge alive." He pointed his fork at the pie. "This is the good. This is the best thing I've ever had in my mouth, and I'm including my own mother's table. God keep her. Pruitt can't bake. All he can do is make you doubt. Don't let him cook for you, Grace. Don't let him put his thumb in your pie." She laughed despite herself, a wet and grateful laugh, and the shaking eased. The last pressure came at dawn. They woke to find the orchard gate open and hoofprints among the trees. Someone had driven a horse through in the night, and a dozen of the gnarled old apple trees had been stripped or trampled, the hard tart fruit scattered and bruised in the grass. Not all of it, but the trees Grace favored, the oldest and best, had been hit hardest. Daniel's jaw went tight. He couldn't reach the pie, so he reached the apples. But Grace was already moving through the wet grass, gathering. "He doesn't understand the apples," she said, and there was something almost like joy in it. "He thinks bruised fruit is ruined fruit because that's true of his soft, sweet-eating apples. But these," she held up a hard green apple, dented and perfect, "these I have to cook anyway. A bruise cooks out. He's done me no harm at all. He's only told me he's afraid." They had enough. They had, in fact, exactly enough. The morning of the fair, the oven betrayed her. Grace had risen at 3 to bake the true pie fresh, so it would be at its peak. But the Grange oven, where finalists were required to do their final baking on site under the committee's eye, a rule meant to prevent cheating, ran hotter on one side than her own ever had. She did not know its temper. She set her pie in and 20 minutes later smelled it. The unmistakable, throat-closing smell of crust going past gold to brown to the edge of black, and juice beginning to smoke on the hot stone floor. The smell of 3 years ago, the smell of her shame. In a room full of women who remembered it, watching her, smelling it too. Grace pulled the pie. The bottom edge nearest the hot wall had scorched, a black crescent along one side, and the smell hung over the Grange kitchen like an accusation. Someone tittered. She heard it. She did not look up to see whose mouth it had come from. For a moment she was 22 again, a bride in a smoking kitchen, certain she was no good and never would be, that she had married a man she could only fail. The whole long year of burned crusts rose up and told her it had all been for nothing. There was no time to bake another. The judging was at noon. It was 9:30. She carried the ruined pie out the back of the Grange and stood in the alley with it, alone, and she very nearly wept. But she did not. She made herself look at the pie instead of feeling about it. She made herself pay attention. And paying attention, she saw the scorch was only on the one edge. The crust across the rest of the top was perfect, golden, high-crimped, the slit cut clean. The filling had not boiled over from her error, but from the ovens, and the filling itself, when she pressed a fork to the good side, was exactly right, tart and dark and holding its shape. The pie was not ruined. The pie was wounded on one side. And a wounded thing, her mother-in-law's voice said quietly in her memory, can still be saved if you pay attention. Grace went back inside, set the pie on the cooling rack, good side out, and went to find Mrs. Vance. "I need a knife, a clean cloth, and 10 minutes no one watches me," she said. "And I need to know, does the rule say a pie must be whole, or only that it must be one pie baked here by my hand, Mrs. Vance's sharp eyes traveled to the scorched crescent and understood everything. "One pie, baked here by your hand," she recited. "Whole is nowhere in it. A beat. I wrote the rules myself after a dropped pie in '86. I left that gap on purpose. Go on, child." What Grace did. In the 10 minutes Mrs. Vance bought her by standing in the kitchen doorway, discussing the weather with great determination, was simple and required nothing but nerve and attention. She trimmed the scorched crescent away with the clean knife, cutting back to good golden crust, and she found that the wound was shallower than it looked. A thumb's width of char, over filling that was still, sound beneath. She squared the cut neat so it looked intentional, and she turned the pie in its pan so the trimmed edge faced the back. Then she did the thing her year of practice had taught her that no recipe ever could. She took a little of the coarse brown sugar and a pinch of cinnamon, and she dusted the whole top of the pie in a fine, even fall, the way frost comes down, so that the warm, dark sugar caught in the crimped ridges and gave the whole surface a deliberate, finished, glittering look, and hid, in plain sight, the place where the back edge had been cut. It did not look like a wounded pie. It looked like a pie made by a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and had meant every bit of it. She set it on the table among the others, under its cloth. Now the trap. Daniel, out front, had spent the morning making a great fussing show over the decoy, a handsome, pale, ordinary sweet apple pie registered under Grace's name as number 11. He'd carried it like a newborn, set it down with 3 adjustments, mopped his brow over it. And across the grange, leaning in the office doorway with a toothpick turning, Aldous Pruitt had watched number 11 the way a cat watches a hole. Hobbs hovered near the entry table, sweating, waiting for his moment to do whatever a desperate man does to a pie. But Grace's true pie had come in under the arm of a brisk widow who'd set it on, the bake sale table with a dozen others, fussing that some careless soul had muddled the tables again. And at 5 minutes to noon, Mrs. Hetty Vance, stickler for order, sailed across the room, declared loudly that a sale pie had got in among the entries, and an entry had strayed to the sale. Honestly, the disorder this year, and with brisk authority she swapped them. The pretty pale pie, number 11, she whisked off to the sale table. The dark, sugar-frosted pie she set firmly in number 11's place before the judges, and pinned the number to its pan. It was done in 8 seconds, in full view, scolding the whole time. No one watching could have called it anything but a flustered widow tidying up. Pruitt's eyes followed the pretty pie to the sale table. Hobbs, confused, drifted after it. They guarded a decoy. The judges came at noon. The Methodist minister, a seed merchant from Emporia, with a reputation for an honest palate, and old Mrs. Abernathy, who had won the pie ribbon herself 11 times before age, retired her to the bench. They moved down the table tasting, conferring in low voices, spitting nothing out, which the crowd watched for. At number 11 they stopped. The seed merchant took his bite and went still. He took a second bite, which he had not done at any other pie. He passed his fork to the minister without a word. Old Mrs. Abernathy tasted, and her eyebrows rose, and she leaned close and breathed in over the dark, crimped surface and said, loud enough to carry, "Sorghum, Lord above. Nobody's made a sorghum and tart apple pie at this fair since I was a girl." She tasted again, and nobody made it this well even then. The 3 judges put their heads together. The crowd pressed in. Pruitt, sensing something wrong, came off the office door frame. The minister cleared his throat and read from his card. First premium, $100, the grand pie of Harlan County. Number 11. Will the baker come forward? Grace stepped out from the wall where she had been holding Daniel's hand hard enough to leave marks. The sound that went through the crowd was not what she had braced for. She had braced for laughter. What came instead was a kind of astonished murmur, And then, started by Mrs. Vance, carried by Daniel, taken up by the Olsons and the Reeds and old Whitfield and every other family Pruitt held paper. On. Applause. Honest, surprised, swelling applause for the woman whose smoking pie they'd all laughed about, who had crossed back over her own shame on her own 2 feet. Pruitt pushed forward. "I'd ask the committee to verify the entry," he said, smooth and quick. "Rules are rules. Was that pie brought whole?" "Baked here. I saw it handled on the sale table. Baked here this morning in your committee's own oven under 3 witnesses," Mrs. Vance said. "By Mrs. Bowen's own hand, 1 pie. Read the rule, Aldous. I wrote it." She held out the rule card. He did not take it. The seed merchant frowned at Pruitt. "You seem powerful interested in disqualifying the best pie I've tasted in 20 years of judging, mister. Why's that?" The question hung there, and in the hanging of it, several people who owed Aldous Pruitt money looked at him with new and thoughtful eyes. But Grace was not finished, and this was the part she had planned in the dark over her slate. She did not gloat. She turned to the table where the association's treasurer sat with the strong box of premium cash, and she said, clearly, "I'd ask to be paid the premium now, in coin here on the grounds as the livestock premiums are paid. I'm told that's the custom." It was. The treasurer, a fair man, counted out $100 in gold and silver into Grace's hands while the county watched. She turned then to Pruitt, and she did not raise her voice. "My husband's note is due to you at noon. It is not yet 1 o'clock." She counted $90 back out of the 100, there in the open air, and held it out to him in front of every soul who owed him, and every soul who'd laughed. "Paid in full. I'll have the paper marked satisfied, please. The committee can witness." There was nothing Pruitt could do. To refuse paid money before that crowd, after that question about the pie, would have shown the wolf entire. He took the coins. His hand, Grace noticed, was not quite steady. The paper was marked, witnessed, and signed. She kept $10. It was exactly enough for seed. That evening, Grace stood again in her own kitchen, where 3 years before she had wept over a pan she could not save. The window was open to let the prairie cool come in, and on the sill cooled a pie, an ordinary pie, for no contest, for no one but the two of them. Daniel came in from the barn. He was not whistling. He hadn't whistled, she realized, all afternoon. He set the satisfied note on the table where they both could see it, and put his arm around her, and they looked out together at the wheat that would go in come spring, on their own ground free and clear. "The oven behaving itself?" he asked. Grace smiled at the steady, even heat. "We're friends now," she said.